Today I'm going to read a story from the Reader's Digest Anthology of the World's Best Fairy Tales, edited by Bell Becker Seidemann. This story is called The Princess on the Glass Hill. The main character is called Cinderlad. We all know about Cinderella. This one is Cinderlad. Princess on the Glass Hill. Once upon a time there was a man who had a meadow which lay on the side of a mountain, and in the meadow there was a barn in which he stored hay. Every St. John's Eve, when the grass was at its height, it was all eaten clean up, just as a flock of sheep had gnawed it down to the ground during the night. This happened once, and it happened twice. But then the man grew tired of losing his crop and said to his sons, he had 3 of them, and the third was called Cinderlad, that one of them must go and sleep in the barn on St. John's Eve, for it was absurd to let the grass be eaten up again, blade and stalk. The eldest was quite willing to go to the meadow. He would watch the grass, he said, and he would do it so well that neither man nor beast, nor even the devil himself, should have any of it. So he went to the barn and lay down to sleep. But when night was drawing near, there was such a rumbling and such an earthquake that the walls and roof shook. And the lad jumped up and took to his heels, and the barn remained empty again that year. Next St. John's Eve, the second son was willing to show what he could do. He went to the barn and lay down to sleep, as his brother had. But when night fell, there was a great rumbling, and then an earthquake, which was even worse. And the youth heard it, and he was terrified, and went off running as if his life depended on it. The year after, it was Cinderlad's turn, but when he made ready to go, the others laughed at him. "Well, you're just the right one to watch the hay, you who never learned anything but how to sit among the ashes and roast yourself by the fire," said they. Cinderlad, however, did not trouble himself about what they said, and when the evening grew near, he rambled away to the outlying field. He went into the barn and lay down, but in about an hour's time the rumbling and creaking began, and it was frightful to hear. "Well, if it gets no worse than that, I can stand it," said Cinderlad. In a little time the creaking began again, and the earth quaked so that all the hay flew around the boy. "Oh, if it gets no worse than that, I can stand it," said Cinderlad. Then came a third rumbling and a third earthquake, so violent the boy thought the walls and roof had fallen in. When that was over, everything suddenly grew still as death around him. Cinderlad thought the upheaval would come again, but everything was quiet, and everything stayed quiet. After a short time he heard something that sounded as if a horse were chewing just outside the barn door. He crept to the door to see what it was, and there stood a horse eating away. It was so big and fat, and fine a horse, that Cinderlad had never seen one like it before. The saddle and bridle lay upon it, and a complete suit of armor for a knight, and everything was copper, so bright it sparkled. "Ha ha, it's you who eats our hay then," said the boy. "I will stop that." So he made haste and took out his flint for striking fire, for it has power over animals. He threw a spark over the horse, and then it could not stir from that spot, and the boy could do what he liked with it. He mounted and rode away to a place no one knew of but himself, and he tied the horse up. Then he went home, and his brothers laughed and asked how he got on. "You didn't lie long in the barn if you have been even as far as the field," said they. "I lay in the barn till the sun rose," said the boy. "What made you two so frightened?" "Well, we shall soon see whether you've watched the meadow or not," answered the brothers. But they found the grass just as long as thick as it had been the night before. The next St. John's Eve, neither of the 2 older brothers dared to go to the outlying field and watch the crop, but Cinderlad went, and everything happened exactly as before. There was a rumbling and an earthquake, and then another, and then a third. All 3 earthquakes were much very much more violent than they had been the year before. Everything became as still as death again, and the boy heard something chomping outside the barn. When he went to look through a crack in the door, there was a horse standing by the wall of the house, eating and chewing. It was far larger and fatter than the first horse, and it had a saddle on his back and a bridle too, and a full suit of armor for a knight, bright silver, and as beautiful as anyone could wish to see. "Ho, ho," said the boy. "Is it you who eats our hay in the night? I'll put a stop to that." So he took out his flint for striking fire and threw a spark over the horse's mane, and the beast stood there as quiet as a lamb. Then the boy rode this horse too, away to the place where he kept the other, and then went back to the house again. "I suppose you'll tell us the grass hasn't been touched this time either," said the brothers. "Well, so it hasn't," said Cinderlad. And there it was, the grass standing as high and thick as it had been before. But that did not make them any kinder to Cinderlad. When the next St. John's Eve came, neither of the older brothers was brave enough to go to the outlying barn to watch the grass, but Cinderlad dared to go. There were 3 earthquakes, each worse than the other, and the last flung the boy all the way across the barn. And then suddenly everything became as still as death. When he had lain quietly a short time, he heard the chewing sound outside the barn. He peeped through the crack of the door, and behold, there stood a horse just outside, much larger and fatter than the other 2 he had caught. The saddle and the bridle were gold, and there was a suit of golden armor too. "Ho, ho, it's you then who eats our hay this time," said the boy. "I will put a stop to that." So he pulled out his flint for striking fire and threw a spark over the horse, and it stood as still as if it had been nailed to the field, and the boy could do just what he liked with it. He mounted the horse and rode away to the place where he kept the other 2. Then he went home again. The 2 brothers mocked him just as they had done before, but Cinderlad did not trouble himself about that, telling them to go to the field and see. This time also the grass was standing, looking as fine and thick as ever. Now it happened that the king had a daughter, whom he offered to give to the one who could ride to the top of a very high hill of glass, slippery as ice, which stood close to his palace. Upon the top of this, the king's daughter was to sit with 3 golden apples in her lap. And the man who was able to ride up and carry off the 3 golden apples would marry her and have half the kingdom. The king had this proclaimed throughout the whole kingdom, and in many other kingdoms too. The princess was very beautiful, and all who saw her fell in love with her in spite of themselves. It is needless to say that the princes and knights were eager to win her, and half of the kingdom besides. They came riding from the ends of the world, dressed so splendidly that their raiment gleamed in the sunshine, riding on horses which seemed to dance as they went. There was not one of these princes who did not think he was sure to win the princess. When the day of the contest arrived, there was such a host of knights and princes at the foot of the glass hill that it made one dizzy to look at them. Everyone who could walk or even crawl was there to see who could win the king's daughter. Cinderlad's 2 brothers were there too, but they would not hear of letting him go with them, for he was so dusty and grimy from sleeping among the ashes that they said everyone would laugh at them if they were seen in the company of such an oaf. "Then I will go by myself," thought Cinderlad. When the 2 brothers appeared at the scene, the princes and knights were trying hard to ride up the glass hill that their horses so hard, their horses were in a foam. It was all in vain, for no sooner did the horses set foot upon the hill than down they slipped. Not one could even get so much as a couple yards, for the hill was smooth as a glass window pane and as steep as the side of a house. But they were eager to win the king's daughter and half the kingdom, so they kept riding and kept slipping. At length all the horses were so tired they could do no more, and so hot that the foam dropped from them, and the princes and knights were forced to stop. The king was just about to proclaim that the riding should begin afresh on the following day, when suddenly a knight came riding up on a horse of such beauty that no one had ever seen its like before. The knight had armor of copper, and his bridle was made of copper too, so bright it sparkled. The other knights called out to him that he might just as well spare himself the trouble of trying to ride up the glass hill, for it was of no use, but he did not heed them, and rode straight off to it, and went up as if it were nothing at all. Thus he rode for a long time. It might have been a third of the way to the top, but he turned his horse around and rode down again. The princess thought she had never seen so handsome a knight, and while he was riding up she was thinking, "Oh, how I hope he'll be able to come to the top." When she saw that he was turning his horse back, she threw down one of the golden apples after him, and it rolled into his shoe. But when he reached the bottom of the hill, he rode away so fast no one knew what had become of him. All the princes and knights were bidden to present themselves before the king that night, in order that he who had ridden so far up the hill might show the golden apple, which the king's daughter had thrown down. But no one had anything to show. One knight after another presented himself, and none could show the apple. That same night, Cinderlad's brother came back with a long story to tell. At first they said there was no one able to even get as much as one step up the hill. But then came a knight who had armor of copper and a bridle of copper, and his armor and trappings were so bright they shone for a great distance, and it was a grand sight to see him riding. He rode 1/3 of the way up the glass hill. He could easily have ridden the whole way up if he had liked, but he had made up his mind that that was enough. "Oh, I should have liked to see him too, that I should," said Cinderlad. The next day the brothers were about to set out again, and this time too Cinderlad begged to go with them to see who rode, but no, they said, he was not fit to do that, for he was much too ugly and dirty. Well, well, then I will go all by myself, thought Cinderlad. So the brothers went to the glass hill, and all the princes and knights began to ride again. Not one could even get so far as a yard up the hill. When they had tired out their horses so they could do no more, they again had to stop altogether. Just as the king was thinking it would be well to proclaim that the riding should continue the next day, so they might have one last chance, he suddenly thought it would be well to wait a little longer to see if the knight in copper armor would come on this day too. Nothing had been seen of him. But just as they stopped looking for him, a knight came riding up on a steed that was much, much finer than the one that the knight in copper armor had ridden. This knight had silver armor and a silver saddle and bridle, and all were so bright they shone and glistened when he was still a long way off. Again the other knights called to him and said he might just as well give up the attempt to ride up the hill, for it was useless to try. But the silver knight paid no heed to them, and rode straight away to the glass hill, and went further than the knight in copper armor had. When he had ridden 2/3 of the way to the top, however, he turned his horse around and rode down again. The princess sat longing that he might be able to reach her, and when she saw him turn back, she threw the second apple after him, and it rolled into his shoe also. And as soon as he reached the bottom of the glass hill, he rode away so fast that no one could see what had become of him. In the evening, when everyone was to appear before the king and the princess, one knight after another went in, but none of them had a golden apple to show. The two brothers went home, as they had the night before, and told Cinderlad how everyone had ridden, but that no one had been able to get up the hill. But last of all, they said, came a knight in silver armor, and he had the silver bridle on his horse and a silver saddle, and oh, he could ride. He took his horse 2/3 of the way up the hill, but then he turned back. He was a fine fellow indeed, and the princess threw the second golden apple to him. Oh, how I should have liked to see him too, said Cinderlad. On the third day everything happened as it had been before. Everyone waited for the knight in silver armor, but he was nowhere in sight. At last, after a long time, came a knight riding upon a horse that was so fine its equal had never yet been seen. The knight had golden armor, and the horse, and a golden saddle, and a bridle. And these were all so bright they shone and dazzled everyone, even while the knight was still at a great distance. The other princes and knights did not think to call him how useless it was to try, so amazed were they at his magnificence. He rode straight away to the glass hill and galloped up as if it were no hill at all, and the princess had no time even to wish he might reach the top. As soon as he had ridden to the top, he took the third golden apple from the lap of the princess and turned his horse around and rode down again. He vanished from sight before anyone was able to say a word to him. When the two brothers came home that night, they had much to tell of how the riding had gone that day, and at last they told about the knight in the golden armor too. He was a grand fellow. Another such splendid knight is not to be found anywhere in the world, said the brothers. Oh, how I should have liked to see him too, said Cinderlad. Next day all the knights and princes were to appear before the king and the princess, so that he who had the third golden apple might produce it. They all went in for turn, first princes, then knights, but none of them had a golden apple. But somebody must have it, for with our own eyes we all saw a man ride up and take it. So he commanded that every man in the kingdom should come to the palace to see if he could show the apple. One after another they all came, but no one had the golden apple, and after a long, long time, Cinderlad's two brothers came likewise. They were last of all, so the king inquired of them if anyone else in the kingdom was left to come. Oh yes, said the two, we have a brother, but he couldn't have the golden apple. He never left the cinder heap on the day any of the 3 days. Never mind that, said the king. As everyone else has come to the palace, let him come too. So Cinderlad was forced to go and appear at the king's palace. Have you the golden apple? Asked the king. Yes, said Cinderlad. Here is the first, here is the second, and here is the third too. And he took all 3 apples out of his pocket. And with that he threw off his sooty rags and appeared before them in his bright golden armor, which gleamed as he stood. You shall have my daughter and half of my kingdom as well, and you have truly earned both, said the king. So there was a wedding, and Cinderlad married the king's daughter, and everyone made merry at the feast, for all of them could make merry, though they could not ride up the glass hill. And if they have not left off their merrymaking, they must be at it still.